We discuss now governance in a little more detail. The content of the governance section is the following. We are discussing why governance is important in business and also look at some of the problems associated with activity and entity system governance. We provide the theoretical background of governance and then key concepts and systemic guiding principles of governance in general and activity system governance specifically. We look at redesigning and managing activity system governance. Why is it important to business? Well, simply, governance is responsible ultimately for the development of the organization. If the environment changes, it is up to the organizational governance to respond to those changes flexibly and appropriately and rapidly. So the faster the change, the more flexible and the more rapidly changing the organization itself must be. Systemic governance that we are discussing in this module wires the organization for ongoing change. What that means is it embodies governance into the different functions of the organization. It embeds maximum self-governance into the different parts of the organization in a coordinated manner. An organization that is not wired for change or that has inappropriate governance is likely to be retarded and can even be destroyed in the context of a rapidly changing environment. Some of the inappropriate governance would be a bureaucratic organization, outdated aims, outdated procedures, too many procedures, inflexible procedures, or hidden aims, or conflicting aims, or different aims at different levels in the organization. So all the problems that we have discussed in the context of the different forces of organization are ultimately the responsibility of governance to sort out. And this is really what organization transformation is about, to look at all those problems, surface them, and find appropriate solutions for them, and then maintain an appropriate functioning. Governance-related problems associated with an activity system include the wrong type of regulation, namely using form-maintaining, form-creating, or form-destroying regulation in the wrong context, and also insufficient or inappropriate self-governance or external governance. This could be either too much self-governance that is not limited by external governance, or too much external governance which doesn't allow sufficient self-governance, in any combination. Another set of problems refers to no or poor performance management. This can be due to lack of controls or performance criteria that are inappropriate, or that monitoring or evaluation mechanisms are absent or not enforced or not sufficient. Some of the governance-related problems of entity systems are the following: that there are governance frameworks that are uncoordinated, or that there are no overarching governance frameworks in an organization. That means that governance frameworks reside in parts of the organization being suboptimal in terms of the larger whole. Another problem is if coordinating governance is not enforced. There may be laws or rules or regulations around it, but if they're not enforced, then there will be suboptimization. Insufficient performance management could also be a governance problem. This could be due to lack of criteria and/or lack of performance management procedures. Or performance management could be uncoordinated and not standardized. That means different parts of the organization have different criteria and even different monitoring and evaluation mechanisms and procedures. No learning happening across the organization can also be due to lack of governance, especially that associated with knowledge management. It can result in repeated mistakes being made in different parts of the organization and at different intervals, or that the wheel gets reinvented regularly. We have heard that there are 7 forces of system organization, one of them being governance. Governance has an overarching role amongst those 7 because it influences all of them. The emphasis of governance in activity systems and entity systems differs. We can see from the figure that governance interfaces with the other forces. What this means practically is that the governance force is governing or managing each of the other forces. For example, it implies that we govern environmental relations, that we govern or manage our substance, that we govern how and who is deciding ethos for our system, who and how are aims determined, who and how creates the flow of process structure and sets the governance for the system. So we are dealing here with the governance of governance. Then we have said previously that the 7 forces of system organization determine both an activity system and an entity system, but that the emphasis of each of the forces differs with respect to these 2 types of systems. In the case of governance, we emphasize regulation or aims achievement in the context of the activity system, while we emphasize coordination between the activity systems in the entity system governance. Activity system governance consists of aim setting, that is what the system wants to achieve, and regulation, how the system is going to achieve what it wants. And that this involves feed-forward and feedback mechanisms like feeding aims and planning forward to the system, monitoring how the system performs, and evaluating the performance would be feedback mechanisms. We have also learned about tapping, that if we are feeding forward an aim, for example, or a plan to a system, it needs to tap that, incorporate that in order for governance to continue. We have also discussed different types of regulation, namely form creating, form destroying, and form maintaining, and that we need to use the right type of regulation in the right context if we really want to achieve our aims. We need this knowledge again in the context of entity system governance. The emphasis of governance in entity systems is coordination between activity systems. This will require the cascading of aims through all systems from the level of the entity system into each activity system and into each sub-activity system. For this, we will require coordinating governance structures. That is, more specifically, we will need to create planning forums along the 3 dimensions of the matrix. And we need coordinating frameworks and criteria, which are also cascaded into each of the activity systems and sub-activity systems. And these frameworks and criteria need to very carefully look at what type of regulation they embody, if it is form creating, form destroying, or form maintaining. And we must ensure that they embody the correct type of regulation. And when we deal with entity system governance, we will emphasize a governance hierarchy. Cascading means governance hierarchy. It means that if we have self-governance at, for example, the sub-activity level, there is external governance from the activity system and entity system level cascaded that limits self-governance. So the alternation between self-governance and external governance through the systems hierarchy is a very important principle of systemic governance. We have also previously discussed the difference of governance roles, namely management and leadership. And if we are looking at the difference between activity and entity system governance, to achieve the goals within an activity system requires management. To align the different interests of the different activity systems will require leadership. This section deals with the key concepts and systemic guiding principles of governance in general. The definition of governance. The word is derived from the Latin gubernare and means to steer. So steering a ship is a very good analogy of what governance is about. We have the ship that goes on its way, and by turning the rudder, in other words, giving different information, we shift the whole boat into a new direction. So this is really ultimately what governance is about, to direct the operations of the organization. The governance of a system consists on the one hand of aim setting. We have already discussed aims. Every system must have aims, overarching aims like purpose, mission, vision, ideals, objectives, strategies, etc. This is typically done in the course of planning. So planning is an important governance activity. And the other aspect of governance is regulation. Regulation makes those adjustments to the functioning that allow the system to achieve its intended aims. This requires regulatory criteria, like more specifications of how performance should be made and what the outcomes should be, regulatory frameworks, as well as regulatory processes like feed-forward and feedback activities. Feed-forward would be giving instructions of what should be done, while feedback includes monitoring the outcomes, evaluating the outcomes, and then, of course, making the necessary adjustments. So governance is actually a sub-activity system of an activity system. So every activity system, if it is regular and organized, has a sub-activity system that governs it. The graphic depiction of that sub-activity system is aligned with a governance arrow tip. This arrow tip is distinct from the other arrow tips of activity system that denotes our aim, or the time-space arrow tip that we put in the time-space graphs, or the impact arrow tips. Governance involves feed-forward as well as feedback activities. And because of the duality or two-directionality of activity, we give the governance arrow two arrow tips. Governance spans the whole activity system, from the inputs to the outputs. To denote that, we represent the governance arrow as a bracket rather than a single line. One of the first governance rules that we need to understand is that regulation tends to overrule aims. So if we are preaching a particular course, a particular aim, but our regulation pushes the system in a different direction, then we will not achieve the aim. For example, in an organization, if we want knowledge sharing, and because we want to build a learning organization, but in our reward systems, we are rewarding and evaluating personal knowledge, personal expertise, then people will not be willing to share knowledge because it is neither valued nor rewarded. So the rule of thumb is you get the behavior you reward and evaluate. Therefore, evaluate and reward the behavior you want. As a management consultant, we encounter that often if we go into an organization and they try to achieve something, and in spite of training, in spite of preaching, it is not being done. One of the reasons why that is not happening is a reward system that overrules the desire. So one is advised to look, is there a rule somewhere that prevents the system to achieve the set aim? We can look at different types of governance. The first type of governance is according to origin, and we can distinguish between self-governance and external governance. Self-governance has to do with empowerment. The system and the members of the system are empowered to make decisions themselves, while external governance is power over. Some external force would say this is or isn't allowed. The governance rules involved is that ideally one ensures maximum self-governance. The reason for that is that the system has most information available to be able to make decisions that are really appropriate to the situation, while external governing agents normally are not so familiar. That is why organizations, when they have different business units in different parts, geographic regions, for example, would give lots of self-governance to those business units. External and internal governance form a governance hierarchy. In other words, even if a system is empowered to do its own thing, it is always within a certain framework of external governance. For example, we can drive throughout the country wherever we want, as long as we stick to the externally determined traffic rules. Likewise, the business units in different countries can exert a lot of self-governance, but there will be rules and regulations for the organization as a whole that each business unit has to adhere to. So the wider the framework of self-governance is, the more self-governance is possible, the more decentralization is possible. Ultimately, external governance always limits self-governance because every system exists within a larger system which exerts governance. So every organization exists within a society, society exists on the planet, and all those systems exert their own governance, and if a system wants to survive, it needs to adhere to those limits. Another way of looking at governance is according to the effect the governance has. And we can distinguish three types of governance: form maintaining, form creating, and form destroying governance. In other words, we can have governance that maintains the system, the form of the system exactly as it is. The typical example that is always mentioned in system thinking is the air condition. The air condition maintains the temperature in the room. As soon as the temperature goes out of range, the governance kicks in and cools or heats the temperature so that the temperature stays within a narrow range. Most laws are form maintaining. They want to make sure that the society or the organization or the family are adhering to a set of rules and do not exceed those in their behavior. Form creating governance means that we want to change the form of the system. We want to develop the system, we want to be creative, we want to transform the system. For this we need form creating governance. For example, In education, when our aim is to really develop every pupil or student as much as possible, we need form-creating governance. An example would be, the more questions a student asks, the more information will be given. Obviously, at some stage, a form-maintaining governance needs to kick in, because if the teacher is always answering the questions of that one very interested and bright student, the other students will be neglected. So while form-creating governance is very motivating, form-creating, it needs to be limited. Another example would be, the more one works, the more bonus one gets. There is some point when one says you cannot work more because you would burn out, for example. So form-maintaining governance of being tired or exhausted or burned out would kick in. Form-destroying governance is used when we want to get rid of behavior that is not desirable, discrimination, criminal behavior, for example, or behavior that the system cannot tolerate, and those are normally associated with sanctions. The governance rules, form-maintaining tends to limit form-creating governance. In other words, there's always some form-creating governance that sooner or later comes to the fore to limit form-creating. At the same time, in creativity, we have the opposite. Form-creating overrules form-maintaining governance. So if we want to change the system, we want to have new rules, new aims, then we need to overrule the form-maintaining governance that exists. Otherwise, we will not have a transformation of the system, but the system will carry on as it is now. However, once we have transformed the system, we have decided on new rules, on new aims, on new governance processes, we need to create form-maintaining governance to maintain that new system. And we need to have form-destroying governance to make sure that there is not some element destroying the new order we have created. If we fail to put form-maintaining and form-destroying governance into place, then there will be the tendency that the system carries on reinventing itself and probably going into an anarchic state, becoming an anarchy. In praxis, it is important to balance those three types of systems within an organization or within society. Failing to do that, if, for example, form-maintaining tends to overrule form-creating where we should have form-creating, we would have a bureaucracy. We would not be a very creative organization. While the creative organization that has no form-maintaining governance keeps running wild, so to speak. Governance always forms a hierarchy. If you're looking at nature, for example, the calcium household in the body has, I believe, 12 governance loops. It's a hierarchy of 12 different governance circuits, always one kicking in if the previous one doesn't work. So if 11 governance loops are not working, there's a 12th. In society or in organizations, we normally don't very well look at these governance loops. We are often putting rules in place, but then we don't police them. There's no governance that ensures that those rules are actually being met. And if we don't have those governance loops that ensure that rules are being met, why have the rules in the first place? So the hierarchy alternates between internal and external governance. There's always an internal governance at the next level of the systems hierarchy. Is internal governance limited by external governance from the next level in the systems hierarchy, and so on? Some of that governance will be form creating, some form destroying, and some form maintaining. So at one level, the system is free to behave in an empowered manner, limited by external form maintaining governance and external form destroying governance. At that next level, there will also be form creating governance limited by form destroying and form maintaining external governance. But there can also be form creating external governance, for example, the encouragement through reward systems would be form creating external governance. Designing a well-balanced governance in an organization or a society, for example, is more an art than a science. We know the rules, but the fine balancing can involve a lot of learning. We try something and we realize it doesn't work, and there is even experimentation. If we come back to our example of steering the ship, very often if one steers an object and turns it away on a new course, there is some kind of overshoot before one corrects again to get more or less on the course. And the same is true for these various governance loops that interact with each other. They're very difficult sometimes to understand in a rational manner because some of them work also in a counterintuitive way, especially if there are time lags involved, that some governance only comes in at a later stage and the system behaves already earlier. So there's a lot of experimentation, but the governance rules are clear, and one can analyze every governance from the point of view of those principles that we have mentioned here. There's also transformative governance. Normally in business, there's a lot of talk, or in society, about leadership. And one of the aspects of leadership is to transform the system. In fact, transformation of a social system without leadership is almost impossible, because it involves changing the existing ethos, the existing values, changing very often existing aims, putting an organization or a social system on a new course, and also changing the rules to reinforce the new aims and the new ethos. And most importantly, one needs to align stakeholders in support of that. So to align stakeholders who have their own interest and convince them that that new ethos, the new aims, the new rules will make sense requires leadership. So for that reason, any transformation is requiring leaders. It may be useful to have a quick look at management versus leadership, because both are governance styles or governance processes. Management typically involves achieving the aims that have been set, the predetermined aims, while leadership means leading outward into a new direction, aligning stakeholders, getting their agreement, and generating cooperation with systems in the outer and inner environment. In other words, leadership works across systems boundaries, and it also involves transforming their own and maybe also aligned systems, as we said, through new ethos, new aims, new rules that reinforce it. If we can use the analogy of the ship again, I would argue that leadership has to do with changing the course of the ship, while management has to do with regulating the ship in such a way that it actually stays on course and achieves the aim set by the course. There is active and passive governance. Up to now, we have discussed active governance. There is, however, also passive governance, which is inherent in the structure of the system. So the structure of the system is not directly exerting a governance, it is indirectly exerting governance in the sense that it allows the matter energy information flow according to the way the structure is configured. We can use the analogy of the river to illustrate that. The riverbed governs indirectly the way the river flows. If it is narrow and steep, the river will flow faster than if it is broad and flat, for example. Likewise, a system channels the flow of its MEI. In the case of an activity system structure, the flow is channeled by the way its support and acting resources are configured. They are responsible for the way the processing matter energy information flows. This is illustrated by a production line. So the supply chain, for example, is governed passively by the way the supply chain structure is configured, as well as, of course, the active governance. In the case of an entity system, its structure channels the way the different activity systems interact with each other and interchange matter energy information. This is illustrated by the organogram, which represents the structure of the entity system. Now let us look more specifically at the governance of an activity system, one of those string-like systems in the biomatrix, or a functional system or business process as we call it in business. The governance of an activity system involves, first of all, setting strategic and operational aims. What is the outcome that the activity system ought to achieve? What is its aim? Typically, that aim is cascaded from overarching organizational and functional systems. So the organization has an overarching mission which determines every single aim to a greater or lesser extent within the organization, and then there are specific functional aims, almost generic aims associated, for example, with IT or with HR or finance. So wherever I am in the systems hierarchy of an organization, the aims need to be cascaded from the organizational as well as my specific functional system. Then we need to determine performance evaluation criteria. We need to set criteria that we know that the aim is being achieved according to certain quality measures, specs, norms, etc. We can distinguish ends criteria and means criteria. What we mean by that is ends criteria describe the outcome, the quality of my output, for example, while the means criteria determine or prescribe how the behavior of the system must be, how my production processes must be. For example, we need to adhere to safety standards, health standards, industry norms. Those guide how we do things. So means criteria are concerned with how we do things, while ends criteria describe what the quality and the outcome of the end, the output of the activity system should be. Again, the ends and means criteria are cascaded from overarching organizational or functional systems. Now, typically, the ends criteria come from the organization and also from functional specifications. So if we talk a business process, it would be the customer who determines how the quality of the product should be that they're producing. And then a governance of an activity system involves also governance mechanisms. That means activity systems or process systems that help us achieve those outcomes in such a way that we meet aims and criteria. Typically, that involves feed forward or planning. In other words, we are telling the system what we expect from the system and how it should behave, specifying the kind of outcome it should achieve, and then feedback mechanisms. We need to find out, monitor and evaluate, are we actually doing the right thing so that we are on the way to achieving those outcomes. And at the end, when we have finished production, did we actually achieve the outcomes? So between the feed-forward and feedback mechanisms, we will adjust the behavior of the system to get the outcomes according to the standards we desire. Now, let us look at governance from a graphic perspective. Here is our activity system, our string-like system or organized process system. For example, it could be a production system in the organization. So first we need the overarching aims that are given from another system, the organization or my functional system. This is external governance. Then we can start our own internal regulation, starting with feed-forward. So planning, what is the aim that we want to achieve in terms of the cascaded aims from the external system. And we also need to determine the outcomes, the criteria, the outcome criteria, also cascaded from the external systems. And this we feed forward. And this is what drives our behavior in the activity system, our MEI flow and our structures within the activity system. Then we need to monitor, and this is where feedback kicks in. We need to monitor and evaluate, are we achieving the aims that we determined beforehand? Are we needing to change? If we are not achieving the aims using the behavior we ought to, we need to make adjustments to MEI flow, or if we do restructuring then of the production line, then we would need to change the production line as well. A cascade governance through all sub-activity systems. This involves cascading aims and criteria into each sub-activity system, adjusting them to make them relevant to that specific sub-activity systems, then regulate the performance of each sub-activity system through the same regulatory mechanism of feedback, feed-forward, and adjustments. The regulated activity systems link up with each other to form a supply chain. The principle of cascading governance is the same for the internal supply chains within an organization as well as for an industry supply chain. So if we illustrate again, we have our production process with sub-processes. If we go back to our baking, the ingredient assembly phase, the dough mixing phase, the baking phase, and so on. Each of those phases is governed. It has its own outcomes that it wants to achieve. It has its own regulation, its own specifications, norms, guidelines of how to go about it. And there's an overarching supply chain governance. And adjustments are made on the basis of feed forward, as well as feed the aims and feedback. So for example, if we have been baking chocolate cakes for a few hours and now the order comes in for a different kind of cake, a nut cake, then feed forward goes a new aim with new specifications which will affect every single phase, the ingredient assembly phase and the mixing phase and the baking phase. And we will have feedback processes that monitor, is the dough of the right consistency, are the ingredients fresh enough, is the temperature in the oven correct. So we are governing the whole supply chain. The governance principles that apply to sequential sub-activity systems apply in the same way to a parallel sub-activity system. It is the same model. If we have an external supply chain, we are using the same principles like if you're using an internal supply chain. Typically, we are not doing overarching supply chain management across industries sufficiently. That is why it comes to inconsistencies between different parts of industries. The regulation of an activity system gives rise to performance management or the performance management cycle. The feed-forward feedback and adjustment in performance management we call planning, which is feeding forward. Then we implement and we have outcomes which we evaluate against the intended outcomes, feedback. And then on the basis of that, we adjust by either replanning, starting the circle all over again, or maintaining the performance of the system. If we also consider the cascading of aims together with the regulation of an activity system, we get the strategic performance management cycle. In other words, we are cascading aims from the organizational and functional strategic plans to the operational plans of our system, which we implement, evaluate, and then on the basis of the outcomes of the evaluation, replan or maintain the system. This section is concerned with redesigning and managing activity system governance. In summary, the design and management of an activity system governance involves the following. We need to establish performance criteria for the various aims and also appropriate reward systems that assure that the aims are achieved. We need to consider the types of governance, that is form creating, form maintaining, form destroying governance, and have an appropriate mix between the three in terms of criteria as well as reward systems. Otherwise, the system will not achieve its aims. We also need to consider relevant governance from the environment. There is generic industry governance, the market governance, then specific demands from clients, suppliers, and other stakeholders. And then, of course, there is the governance from the organization of which the activity system is part that needs to be considered. And there may also be various interacting functions that impact on the governance of the activity system. Then we need to design and manage regular strategic and operational planning and performance management. We need to establish the praxis of stakeholder planning in all non-routine decision-making situations. And we need to establish organizational learning, namely that all planning, strategic planning and also operational planning and performance management is learning-based, and that learning needs to be linked to knowledge repositories. Let us now look at the application of governance in an activity and entity system. We have learned that entity systems consist of outward, inward, and self-directed activity systems, and that these interact in a matrix fashion. Each activity system is governed individually by its own activity system governance, as we have learned of activity system governance before. This is illustrated by the thin orange governance bracket of each activity system. The interaction and balancing between those different activity systems is governed by entity system governance. This is illustrated by the bolder orange governance brackets. The Entity system governance in an organization consists of ongoing planning and performance management, also ongoing knowledge management, coordinating governance frameworks, coordinating governance procedures, amongst others. If we compare in a nutshell the activity and entity system governance, then activity system governance is concerned with achieving the specific aims of the activity system, while entity system governance is concerned with coordination. The governance of an activity system consists of aims setting and regulation, namely regulating the behavior of the system in such a way that it achieves its aims. The same is true for activity systems as a whole, as well as each of its sub-activity systems, which form a supply or value chain. Obviously, governance needs to be cascaded from the overarching activity system to the sub-activity systems and sub-activity systems if we have those. By comparison, the entity system governance is concerned with the coordination of the different activity systems with each other. On the one hand, this is achieved through passive governance in the sense that the structures of the organization enforce a particular way of interaction between the activity systems. On the other hand, it consists of coordinating governance, like frameworks, performance management systems, etc., which are illustrated by the bold orange arrows. The purpose of entity system governance is coordination and governing in such a way that the whole organization is optimized and not its parts.